firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here. I've had a very enjoyable morning. I haven't made paper for several years, and to get one's hands on a really nice beta that you've acquired here and see all this fantastic facilities, I think is, I'm really, really excited. And I think what's planned here, and I know it's still evolving, and it will always evolve, I guess, but it sounds, a really exciting project. Can you all hear me? Right. How many of you know a bit about the history of papermaking anyway? You don't need to be experts. So actually a few have put your hands up, but quite a few haven't. So I'll assume that you don't know too much about it. This talk originally was for a Society of Archivists, or ARA as they're called, talk about 3 or 4 years ago when we were told, it's about 2 hours. So it won't take 2 hours, don't worry about that, but the notes would. So I'm not going to read from the notes, but I might need to refer to them occasionally to remember a few key things that I might not have forgotten. So 90 slides, I'll have to speed through them a bit, but papermaking is the craft and industry of making paper, and there's a whole lot of different terms and definitions of paper, but it's worth remembering what it is. Take apart the vegetable, macerate it, mix it up, strain it out, and make it into a nice even sheet of clean, well, not necessarily clean, whatever kind of paper you want. That's what it's all about. That's what it's made out of. That's a very crude chemical formula. But when we did this talk, we found all sorts of nice images, which is much more fun. And I'm not going to go into chemistry. I'm not quite sure why we've got this one here, but this is about Precesses Paper, which one can go on about a long time. This is parchment, not parchment, this is papyrus. It might even be bark paper. But there's a whole lot of precursors where you took plants and you put them on a board and you walloped them until they stuck together, basically. The difference between them and paper is that they still retain their original structure, which you can see in that illustration there, whereas paper, you take it right down to all these tiny, tiny fibers. And that's what a sheet of paper looks like close up. The fibers have little microfibers coming off them. So it's a very, sorry, it hasn't got a scale on that, but it's a very small scale operation. But one of the key things with cellulose is that it's hydrophilic. It likes to hold on to water. So if you mix all these fibers up with water and then gradually take the water away, the remaining fibers or parts of the chemicals in them are constantly trying to hold on to the same few molecules of water. And that is what's called hydrogen bonding, like in 2 technical. And that's what draws the paper together and so on and so forth. I used to have arguments when I was a student with a textile technology student, and he said, "Oh yes, but what holds it together? It's not like textiles which are held together by friction." I said, "No, this is a bit stronger. This is hydrogen bonding." This is the great old man of papermaking, or an alleged picture of him, Cylon. He can be pronounced in different ways, but he was the first person that set out how to make paper in China in 105 AD. And a lot of people think he invented paper. Well, it's possible, but it's pretty unlikely. I mean, he was a mandarin, his job was to organize things, and almost certainly people were making paper before them, maybe a couple of hundred years before, and maybe not even in China. I mean, my Indian friends will say it was invented in India, but they then forgot how to do it. People in Vietnam and other places said they invented it. But it was basically a very simple field craft. Literally, I've been in Bhutan, this I think is actually Thailand, where they make paper outdoors in pits in the field, like in ponds, effectively, and on individual molds, and when they form the sheet of paper, they just prop them up against a stick and let the paper dry off. This is the cloth mold. And when it's dry, you peel it off and you've got your paper. And so it's a very simple process. These are some Japanese illustrations. This comes, I believe, from something that is translated into English as a handy guide to papermaking. And I think it dates back a couple of hundred years originally. It's been reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. But a lot of the early Oriental papers were made out of the inner bark of shrubs, and in the Himalayas it would be daphne, but in Japan it's things like kozo, mitsumata, and that sort of thing. Basically, the inner part of the plant core is woody, you don't use that. The outer part of the bark is usually a dark colour, you don't use that, but the inner part is a very nice, white, clean, very long fibres. So the answer is to separate all those out. This involves at times cooking, and then you get to the beating, and in the good old days, beating was literally done like beating a horse, you know. Sorry about that for horse lovers, but and you had a table, and you got your wet fibre, and you walloped it until it was right. And really, the machine next door is doing it like that, except that it's a rotary machine, and it's not doing that, but it's rubbing it. But it's still put a lot of effort into it, and your fibre changes. You then strain the fibre out. This picture you could think was illustrating how a lot of artists make paper. They don't actually know what they're doing, so I'm sure this illustrator didn't know. The mould is upside down. They seem to be pushing it down into the whatever, but basically you're lifting a screen out and straining stuff out. I love these pictures, they're very nice. And this is drying on what that is we call carry-barry board. I'm sure Jane will correct me if it's not a carry-barry board, but basically the Oriental papers are so strong, even when they're wet and they're very thin, that you can handle them quite easily, and with the right sort of brush you can actually apply them onto the wall without it all falling apart, because it's not as easy as it looks. So papermaking probably started in China, and it seems to have stayed in China for 600 years, because the Chinese were very, very secretive, as they were with silk and other things. And in fact, Elaine Koretsky, who some of you may have heard of, who's travelled a lot in China, had problems there in taking photographs because papermaking is still regarded in China, or was a few years ago, as a state secret. You could get locked up for it, and she was for a few hours when she got the pictures out. Eventually, though, all these things leak out. Some of it leaked eastwards into Korea and then Japan, and some of it leaked along, effectively, the Silk Route to the west, and then taking a left-hand turn down into India. This is another form of beater. Actually, this is beating marble rock into powder for making porcelain, but it's exactly the same thing. A form a trip hammer, keep walloping the paper, and until about 1700, 1750, this was the way you did the beating, so you had a trip hammer type device. Moulds, very simple. This is a place called Gosunda, which is near Chittorgarh in Rajasthan. And in India, they make the actual mould forming surface, the chapri as it's called, a bit like su, which is what you get in Japan. All these words, zi in Chinese, excuse my pronunciations of all of those, but they make the screens out of a type of grass that they call cousgrass, which they grow specially, and you then put one end of the grass into the neighbouring piece of grass to make a longer piece, sewn together originally with horsehair, and this one may indeed be like that. Nowadays you can make them out of nylon, and with just a simple piece of wood on each end to give it a bit of stiffness, but it's very flexible and it goes onto a heavy wooden frame. And this is Mr. Begg, making paper outdoors in Gosunda in about 1991. And it's a very tragic story about why it's outdoors, but it does show you can do it anywhere. And he's basically making something that looks like wrapping paper, and there's the wall. And you can still see people doing this in India just about today. And you can do it yourself. You've got lots of suitable walls here for drying paper on. And you'll see it marks the wall, so you might not want to do that, but you could do. The earliest way of making paper smooth was to burnish it with an agate stone. And this is Mr. Hussain Kaghzi in Sanganar, which is the main paper-making centre in Rajasthan, glazing paper with an agate stone. And he's making paper still the way it was made in the time of the Moguls. Unfortunately, he's using a lot of the wrong sort of waste paper, and using waste paper as traditional, but and I encourage him very strongly to go back to using older materials, but I'm not quite sure to what extent he's done that. I do know that his son there is now making paper, and I think he's running it. And then this is the other end. This is the Dart Hunter map, who was an American who studied a lot of paper making. This is the other end of the Silk Route and how paper making spread around Europe. And you can see on there that England was Johnny come lately on this, and it took quite a lot of effort to get it off the ground. I'm not sure what this one is doing in here. I did read all of my notes, but you don't want me to look. It's a nice picture. You'll excuse the informality. There's a reason for this one's one. I'll just have a picture. I have no idea. No, I did this joint with my wife, and because of the length of the talk, I skimmed through this, but this was another precursor, basically. But we then get to the first paper maker known about in this country, John Tate, who made paper in Hertfordshire. And he seems to have taken off fairly well, but for some reason or other, when he died, he instructed in his will that his paper mill be taken down and demolished, and we don't really know why. So papermaking started, in the late 15th century, and then sort of stopped again. We carried on importing paper from Holland and France mostly, or the Low Countries. And then we decided, or somebody decided, to import paper makers instead of paper, so it's a bit like the fishing and line and rod and stuff. And this is the tomb of Johann Spielmann, often known in this country as John Spielmann, who was a German paper maker. And he came to England, and he realized that if he could make paper in England to a good standard, he could make loads of money. But he wanted to protect himself, so he went to the king and said, I want an exclusive license to make all the paper in the country and to have all the paper making materials in the country punishable by the normal methods of the time, i.e. death. So he had a monopoly for about 30 years, started a couple of paper mills in Dartford, shipped in a lot of experienced paper makers from southern Germany, and did extremely well for himself. And so well that when his wife died, he commissioned this lovely tomb here, and he realized he was going to die sometimes as well, so he had the whole thing made, and that's in the church in Dartford, and it's really well worth a visit, I can assure you. This is not his paper mill. This is, I believe, from the Nuremberg Chronicles, showing what a German paper mill at the time allegedly looked like, so very quaint and chintzy. I suspect that probably John Spielmann's mill in Dartford didn't look that much different from a more current type of paper mill, such as Hale Mill, which still exists even though it's no longer making paper. This is one of a series of illustrations of paper making, going back again to the same sort of era, it's about the early 18th century, so a little bit later. And again, lovely, lovely pictures. The artist, the illustrator, obviously doesn't know much about the detail, but he gives some idea. It also seems to suggest that paper mills were lovely, airy, spacious places, which actually they often weren't. The mould had evolved over time, so whereas in the Orient moulds were made out of, as I say, in India out of grass, in Japan out of split bamboo, various other things, anything you could make straight line with, they used to use for making laid moulds. And the laid mould is made up of two components. The laid lines are the ones very close together, and they're the actual screen, the draining part of it. And the chain lines are a pair of wires twisted in and out at intervals, and they're just simply to hold the laid lines together. So the chain lines have nothing to do with forming the sheet, they're to give the structure and hold the laid lines together. So as I said, in India, grass and horsehair, but at some point, and we're not quite sure where or when, wire drawing was invented, so that at one time there was no such thing as wire, or if wire did exist, it was made by hammering strips of metal more until they got thinner and thinner to be effectively wire, often square in section, which are obviously very expensive process, all right for making damask, decorations, but not for simple purposes like industrial tools. But at some time, wire drawing, putting it through ever smaller holes, I think usually in stones, was invented, and so they made the leap from natural materials to brass, phosphor bronze, probably originally copper was probably the earliest thing, which is very ductile metal. Phosphor bronze is what was used in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's much more durable, and of course it got more and more industrialized. So this is one of our own molds. It's very similar to the ones you've got here, and the ones I brought with me, all of which you can look at later on. Watermarking had been invented, or watermarking as we know, had been invented in southern Italy, allegedly about 1290. That's the earliest example. It may go back a bit further. It may even not have been invented in Italy, because if wire was invented as a papermaking material in the Arab world, which is quite likely because they have a lot of metalworking skills, then perhaps watermarking was too. The key thing about using wire was that you got away from the flexible mould, so the natural materials, particularly things like horsehair, were flexible, whereas with the Western mould, we call it that, the wire is sewn all over down onto the rigid wooden frame, which involved a change in the technique of getting the sheet off the mould. This is actually wove mould, which is another invention, which was done by Watman, invented wove paper in about 1760, when John Baskerville, the printer, didn't want paper with all those nasty lines in it. And I believe John Baskerville was also involved in wire making. I think, this isn't seem to be agreed by most paper historians, but it does seem to be a bit of a coincidence. This is, despite its appearance, a modern watermark. I commissioned this watermark about 1985 for a paper that we made not very long called Sandwich, and it's based on the coat of arms of the port of Sandwich in East Kent. Of course, when the designer started doing watermarks and sandwiches, he came up with all sorts of ideas like hamburgers and that sort of stuff. So there you see a couple of Watman watermarks, laid paper, and as you can see, this dates back to 1794. Usually in papers of that period and right through the 19th and parts of the 20th century, you had the watermark, which is the elaborate pattern, which usually signifies the size of the paper as well. Always get mixed up, that's the fleur-de-lis, always get mixed up which watermark goes with which size, and it's not entirely consistent. And that was in the middle of the one half of the sheet, and then in the middle of the other half of the sheet, you have what's called the countermark, which identifies usually the papermaker, and for a period of time, the year, because at one stage, government in the UK demanded that you put the year of manufacture, and it with serious consequences if you forgot to change the date, which has happened in my time. It's easily enough done in January and February to change the date. And after the law was repealed, people kept putting the date in, or many mills did, we certainly did. And then watermarking got a lot more sophisticated. This is watermarked by Fabriano, the most famous mill in Italy, for doing fine watermarks. And cutting a long story short, this chiaroscuro technique, you carve into a block of wax into differing depths to give the differing shading that you want in the picture. You then rub carbon dust into the wax. You can electroplate onto that. Various stages, you finish up with a couple of metal molds that you can put in a press and press the wire to that shape. And as you can see, you can get more or less photographic quality out of it. Another nice picture of paper millstone series. And this is the sort of ultimate expression of the traditional type of trip hammer beating, or stampers as they're known in English. And there are still places that you can go and visit now that have stampers. One of the best places is Richard Barr in the Auvergne, central France. But the Fabriano Museum has a reproduction set of stamps which I believe they use. And even want to go to Capiades near Barcelona, which has stampers. And there are people in America making stampers just because they're interested in them. So it's basically very simple, but the head of the stamper can be varied. You can have a plain wooden head, but often they have special metal teeth in them, which can be differing sizes to achieve different effects on the fibre. I'm not going to try and explain beating in too much detail now, because it's a very big subject. This was replaced by what's called the Hollander beater. Again, who did this drawing, even though it looks very precise, it's a bit peculiar, but the basic idea of a Hollander beater is to have a rotating roll which can be driven by a windmill, as there's still a mill in Holland driven by a windmill, or it can be driven more commonly by a water wheel, and more recently by diesel engines or electricity. And the roll, you can see, has metal bars across its face, and it rotates just in contact with a bed plate which has similar bars on it. And this goes around quite fast, over 100 RPM, and that roll in a production beater can weigh 5–10 tons. So it's very heavy, and those tiny, tiny little fibres, I mean, I've got tens of millions in my hand here, you know, they suffer a huge pounding. Now I say metal, but if you look carefully at your wonderful beater, it has a granite roll, and the reason for that is that if you make a roll out of granite or a similar stone, and you make very broad bars, and you'll see on that they're getting on for an inch wide, you get a quite different effect, and you can make very dense, strong, hard, translucent paper, like tracing paper. But most beaters have metal bars in them. At one time it's phosphor bronze, now it's more commonly stainless steel. And now this machine is obsolete as well. This is intended to show sizing. So when you first make paper with nothing but cellulose fibre from plants in it, it's like blotting paper, it just absorbs ink, water, anything, so obviously not suitable for writing on. And the earliest type of sizing, still in use to a certain extent, is with gelatin, basically made by boiling up skins or bones and extracting the collagen, which when the chemical treatment in extracting it makes it into gelatin, just as you'd have making jelly sweet. And basically you put the paper into slightly warm gelatin, drain it out, press it, dry it, and that gelatin literally fills all the pores in the paper. So gelatin is not resistant directly to absorption of water, as you know, because you can dissolve it to make jelly. But when it's dry and hard, there's nowhere for the liquid to go, it just fills all the pores. And also usually you add alum or sometimes even formaldehyde, which hardens it, makes it less likely to dissolve again. So this was an important stage in the eastern countries. They often use starch, which is still used a lot today as well. Gelatin has the side effect to make the paper much stronger. Sure, what's going on inside? Oh, this is the drying lots. So basically, simplest way of drying paper, hang it up like washing on a line. And this carried on, and still carries on to a certain extent, but we dried paper in lots on lines until about 1900. And we used what were described as cow hair ropes. Well, I think they were just covered in cow hair, because that was less likely to stain than some kinds of vegetable ropes. Later, we replaced that method of drying by having screens and hessian, drying it flat. And the reason for the change was that it's all very well drying it like washing on the line, but you get a fold in the middle, which is all right for a book, because you're going to crease it anyway, but for watercolour painting, which our mill got very involved in, you don't want to have any trace of anything like that, so drying it flat. It's better. This one's gelatin as well. Sorry, I haven't run this for quite a while, so I must apologise. And really got a collection of pictures of various components. So the middle here is another form of glazing method, which is hammering it. So again, it's a type of trip hammer, and in fact, a couple of the artists, they have a trip hammer just like this, stored up to water. The pictures at the top are the saw. So in England, we call the sorting room the saw, or room, as a French for room. And every sheet of paper has to be examined. Some little defects, like specks of dirt, can be picked out. If there's a slight turned over edge, you can flatten it out. And then you decide, is it good quality, is it second quality? In fact, there were 3 levels. Standard, retrieve, French retrier, to try again. So you sorted it once. The sorts, anything that wasn't good was sorted again. Retrier was the better stuff. And then the worst stuff's called outsides, or XXX. And the reason it's called outsides was the traditional way of packing paper was a mill ream, which was 480 sheets, but the outer 50 sheets were outsides, and they protected the inner sheets in transit. Getting into the era of photography, this is the rag house at Springfield Mill in Maidstone in, I think, about 1950. And if you look very carefully, this is something my wife was always very keen on, you'll find a picture of Cliff Richard in here, I think. I think that's how she dated it. Well, perhaps 1960 it was Cliff Richard. But these were really busy, intense areas. So the rags came in, and you cannot imagine how some rags were, particularly if you were bringing rags in from the continent or even from India. They could be very, very dirty, blood-stained, puke, all sorts of things. People did not get rid of their clothes until they really had to. They were valuable, and they cascaded down, and eventually they were ready for paper making. And actually, all of that wear and tear that they'd had in their lives, and exposure to sweat, and being washed on riverbanks and beaten with stones and stuff, was actually part of the preparatory process for paper making. And making paper out of new rags is much more difficult than making paper out of old rags. But, of course, if you want the strongest, you'll probably go for new rags, which doesn't mean decent bits of cloth, it means the offcuts from the factory and so on. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of grades of rags, and we have constant disputes with rag merchants who were trying to sell you things that weren't as good as they were supposed to be, even to the point of having good stuff on the top of the bale but not in the middle. You can imagine all the usual commercial tricks of the trade. How am I doing for time, by the way?
2:15.
Yeah, and what time do we finish?
Well, I think we were going to judge about an hour. This
So
one do a bit
about
of demonstrating.
Yeah, I think we're getting on fairly well here. I should have said at the beginning, you can interrupt if you want to. You probably would have done anyway if you wanted to. And this is sorting rags at Hale Mill. So the sorter had various things to do. She firstly had to make, and they were always women, I'm sorry, but these were not in the days of political correctness. Sheets of paper were made by men, and the sorting of the rags of the paper was done by women. And you can see that the rags come in quite big pieces, so part of the job was to cut them down to about 2 inches square, using a very sharp knife and just drawing the rag across the knife. Ours were usually made out of broken bits of side, so I just welded together and bolted down to the bench. Also to get out some of the dirt by wrapping around on a wire mesh and letting it fall through, cutting off anything that might not be suitable for paper making, particularly buttons. We used to pay the ladies bonus by weight of buttons, and this went on for a long time until we found out that they were then recycling the buttons. So we thought we'd thrown the buttons away, and they thought that they would take them again. So our habit from then on was to throw them in the stream, and even today you can find buttons in our stream. At the Watman Mill at Springfield, they laid them out as a path, and there's, I believe, still a button path which is a couple of metres wide by who knows how deep, quite long, just made out of buttons. The next stage was beating. This is the turkey mill, which was the original Watling mill in Maidstone, but these beaters, I would guess, date from about 1900, 1920 perhaps. And these are actually medium-sized beaters. These will hold, I think, about 150 kilograms of dry fibre, as well as a lot of water. And the big one can hold 5 tons. I'm not going to go into great deal of detail on beating because it's just a complicated subject, but we will start the beater up again later on just so you see what it's like. Then came down into the vat house. This was the vat house at Hale Mill, where we had originally 2 vats in 1812. We got up to about 3 in the 1830s, 4 in the 1860s, 5 in the 1880s and 90s. And we did put in a 6th vat, unfortunately, in 1929, which was not a good year to invest. So you can imagine quite a large labour force. The peak labour force at Hale Mill was about 120, of whom about 60 would have been, it's probably more like 80 would have been women sorting rags, sorting the paper, and the men were doing the beating, making the sheets and drying them. And the normal vat crew was 3 people. So the vatman who stood at the vat and formed sheets of paper, the coocher in the middle who transferred the wet sheets of paper off the mould onto a stack of felt, and the layer who was responsible first for taking the stack of felts and paper and press, and then to separate the wet sheets from the felts. Arthur Watmore on the right was a vatman for a very long time, and he appears in lots of photographs, and he actually suffered in the end from what's known as losing his shake. So the key thing about making paper is the way you shake the mould as you form the sheet, and you could lose it, and if you lost it, you weren't any good at making paper anymore. He lost his shake. Whether it was due to drinking or not, we don't know, because drinking was a big problem with paper mills. Possibly because we gave them pints and pints of beer during the day as part of their wages. Norman Peters was about 16 at the time. He was a bit precocious and learned to make paper much quicker than most of them. Got promoted to vatman, and he was still working at Hale Mill in 1987. Hydraulic press here, ours produced about 200 tons of force. So when you separated all the fibres out into pulp in the beater, it's about 3% fibre. In that, it's about 0.5%. By the time you've transferred it onto the sheet, it's still only about 1% fibre. By the time it's pressed, the paper is about 50% fibre and fairly easy to handle. Of course, before hydraulic presses, you had screw presses, which were traditionally made out of wood. Particularly, you can still see at Richmond Bar, very old press made out of Morello cherry, which is supposed to be the best wood for that. And they used to grow the cherries into a sort of Y shape so when they were big enough, you fit the press together appropriately. Then the paper went up into the loft to be dried. And so here they're actually drying them on wooden rods. They're not actually circular, they're a funny sort of shape. But then in the background you see the right. That's Hale Mill to about 1870. I have one of the best collections of European papermaking photographs anywhere. And I've even got the glass plates for this. But the Photographic Museum of Bradford, when I tried to give them the plates in exchange for really good negatives of them, said, oh, we've got lots of 19th century glass plates, not interested at all. Some of them are even wet collodion, and you can actually see the brush marks of putting the marker down on the sheets. The thing about paper mills is that they're nearly always in valleys for 2 reasons. One is that you need the water power from the stream running down the valley. The Lewes Valley where we are is quite narrow and it's very steep. You grade it to 13 mills in about 3 miles. So you dam it up, you make a series of dams, reservoirs, give you power for the water wheel, but also you need water for the actual paper making, which comes from springs. You can obviously use stream water, but it's usually not clean enough. And believe you me, in the mid-19th century, our stream was disgusting. There was the residue of cooked rags, residue of gelatin, dyes, everything went in the stream, as recorded. The other advantage of being a valley is that you can form a drying loft across the valley like this, and it's effectively an air dam. And in our valley, on the calmest days, there's always a breath of air going up and down the valley. The English loft was made with removable louvers on the side, so you could close it off almost entirely, make it nearly airtight, which could open up and the breeze could blow through. Which seems to be a North European thing. I think in the Low Countries they had the same thing, but most Mediterranean paper mills, perhaps because it's hotter, mostly stone buildings with just openings in the walls with wooden shutters, except around Ombre, that's another story. This is a very rare photograph of hand sizing, and the way they did this was that they grabbed a wad of paper about this thick between two wooden boards, held them together, as you can see there, and wooden boards at each end. So you lowered one end, and then you lowered the other end, and you took the boards off in between times to let the gelatin get in. And then they were pressed again, and then back to the loft for drying. In the 1860, the Hodgkinson mill at Wookey Hole invented a type of sizing machine, and this is one that we bought later on, which speeded up the entire process. So you had a driven set press and continuous felts and a long tub of sizing. Modern, by our standards, method of glazing, plate glazing. This is how hot press paper was made, there was no heat in it. Two steel rolls operating at slightly different speeds with quite high pressure, you get slippage. And you put in what was called a wad of stacked paper and zinc sheets, about 40 of them. And that slipping was what gave the polishing with the pressure. This was our saw, my wife always thinks the ladies have dressed up specially because the photographer was coming. This is in 1921. I'm not so sure. I think they maybe dressed quite nicely all the time anyway, but certainly in these series of photographs you see everybody's looking very smart, but even in my time the ladies were usually smart, not wearing what you might almost think of a Sunday best like this, but they all were, and so were the gents. Norman Peters in 1987 made the last paper. He was 80 at the time, and he came in the morning, rolled up his white shirt sleeves. His shoes were much better polished than mine were. Always had sharply creased trousers. He went home after making 1,000 sheets of paper, looked exactly the same. He did not have pulp on him. He did not have pulp on his shoes. There's a difference between a real craftsman and something like me. But oh, lo and behold, somebody thought, all this business of people dipping models in vat is time-consuming and expensive, and they are very tiresome, these paper makers. Why don't we mechanise? And so in France, in 1798, Louis Robert invented the paper machine. Actually, he invented it, and it did just about work, but it was no use for production because it was more like a prototype. And basically, he had a continuous wire mesh and poured slurry pulp onto the top of it, and came off the other end as a continuous sheet. But it was not developed. And he went bust. The patent was bought to England. A couple of people called Foudrinier Brothers bought the patent and invested a lot of money in developing the paper machine. And the first practical paper machine was made in Kent by Brian Dobkin, who also invented the tin can very successfully and installed a mill in Hertfordshire. And that was about 1808 by the time it became a production tool. By the teens, there were dozens of them. By the 20s, there were 40 or 50 of them. And the number of vats, of course, went down very rapidly in the 19th century, but a few specialists kept going into the 20th century, to 1987 in our case. Before that, people wanted bigger sheets of paper, too big for an individual to lift. So they came up with this device that Watman's invented, which was basically just some lifting tackle, and they could make a sheet of paper about as big as those sheets there in production with a crew of about 9 people. Papermaking felts were so big they tended to disappear onto people's beds. Unfortunately, this is one of the very few still photographs of the process, but some of you may have seen a rather fuzzy movie of it, which I think can be obtained. I don't think it's on YouTube, but it might be. But it was still very hard work, and nothing like as efficient as the paper machine. By the 1820s, the paper machine had been further developed with pressing, and somebody called Crompton had the idea of putting it around a steam-heated cylinder to dry it. So instead of taking off sheets of wet paper, you were now taking off reels of dry paper. So the whole thing was getting more and more mechanized, and it had about 1/9 of the labour requirement in those days on doing it by hand. And somebody also figured out that if you had a little roller pressing on the paper, you could put watermarks into machine-made paper as well. I think this is King George and Queen Mary, by the look of it, but others may say it's not. It's not captured on George's, so that's just my guess. This is a small paper machine at Turkey Mill, which was there until the mill closed in 1976. The Hollingsworth brothers at Turkey Mill were particularly pressing on mechanisation. They were fed up with the paper makers, the Batman and so on. And the Batman were fed up with them, and eventually he did a Rupert Murdoch and put in a paper machine, got rid of all these tiresome paper makers, got more of a technician type person to operate it. That was a lovely, lovely machine. Ran to the middle of 1976, smashed up afterwards. And that's a big machine. That was built in the 1990s at Elsfordville, also in Mason. This is the sort of statistics that you get with a modern paper machine. That used to be the world speed record for making newsprint. Making laboratory papers about twice as fast as that. So you talk about, very high speed machines really whizzing along and getting through huge quantities of raw materials, producing huge quantities of paper. I'm trying to remember what this one's about. Raw materials, yes. So up to now in Europe, am I doing all right time?
We're on sort of 2:30 now.
Okay, nearly there. Up to about 1800, everything's made out of rags, and of course, paper making, more and more paper needed, and not a lot more rags. And so the race was on to invent paper made out of other raw materials, and people looked at things like wasps' nests and straw and trees and so on and so forth. And I think this is Schaefer. Was that Schaefer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was one of the pioneers. Long was on past him. This is, I think, the other chap. What's his name on there? But this was, again, a patent for making paper out of other materials. And one of the other materials was esparto, which is, it's called esparto grass, but I think biologically it's slightly different from a grass. It naturally grows in North Africa, it's also cultivated in Spain. This was fairly easy to extract fibre from, but it did need a lot of cooking, which produced a very unpleasant black licorice. It was called a mixture of caustic soda and gums and juices that came out of the plant. After a period of time, they figured out a way of recycling that and getting chemicals out of it. But esparto makes a very nice printing paper. I think this is all to do with various formula for making paper, but I will speed through that. Various chemicals used. Then people started worrying about all this mechanisation, particularly chemicalisation. And John Murray was one of the first people to publicly start complaining in a big way. One of the other things that had come along was using chlorine for bleaching, which tended to leave residues of hydrochloric acid in paper, which very rapidly led to deterioration and so on. So you can see all know about all this sort of stuff. And this led through to reports such as this one, this is 1928, is it? On durability of paper. I was just looking at this the other day. Apart from the staples, which again conservators know all about, despite the fact that it's a wood pulp paper, it is in pretty good nick because it had been produced with fewer chemicals and so on and so forth. And then there started being a counter movement. And William Morris was part of the arts and crafts movement, and he was advocating purity of materials, simplicity of design, and so on and so forth. And in papermaking terms, he wanted to go back to using linen, to not using bleach, to doing it by hand, and so on and so forth. And he got his paper almost entirely from Joseph Batchelor near Ashford in Kent. And when they stopped making paper in the 1950s, we took on the rights to make Kelmscott paper, named after his Kelmscott house, very near to the press. We never, I didn't think, made paper for Morris, or we didn't have records of it. So all sorts of changes going on. There's just some of them. A big change since about 1700, right? So everything's slightly changing. A few fibres, like all these long names. There's hundreds and hundreds of things used for papermaking. And then there's all these new processes in chemicals, many of which were adverse. This is a letter promoting wood pulp in 1876. So wood pulp really started coming in a big way about 1870. My family were investigating alternative fibres, particularly straw and so on, in the 1830s. In fact, they put so much effort into it, and we think that's why they were passed in 1838, thereby having another term. And then we started getting into alternative types of materials. Hercules powder supplied everything you needed. So you had cotton linters as fibre. You had things like chyming, which was to give wet strengthening. On paper machine, you got a lot of trouble with foams. We put things into to prevent that. Rosin was used a lot for sizing, which combined with alum had bad effects usually. And they later invented something they called aquapel, which was mostly for making milk carton board impermeable, but was later adapted for fine paper making. But so it goes on. I'll leave that on the screen for you to enjoy. That's the end of the talk as such.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Very, very interesting.
So, shall we have a few questions before we go on to make paper?
Yes, let's do
or
that. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Yes, sir.
Yes, please. The map of the spread of paper, was that about the paper making skills as they went across into
Yes,
Europe, or
yeah.
was it just the export of?
No, the export was much earlier. So, like with silk, the Chinese had a monopoly on silk. Nobody knew how silk was made. They had all sorts of theories, but the only place they could get it from was the Chinese, and the Chinese very sensibly didn't let anybody export the technology on pain of death. And the same with paper making. Quite how paper making was reached Japan, I don't know. Korea was obviously very close to China, very influenced by it. But somehow or other, people escaped or whatever. The old story was that papermaking came to the West because there was a big battle at Samarkand in Central Asia in about 600 or 700, and they captured Chinese papermakers allegedly. But current paper history thinking is that actually it was not such a dramatic event at all. I'm not really deeply into that, but before that period, if you wanted paper, you had to buy it through the supply chain back to China. After that, papermaking quite quickly spread around the Arab world and through the Moguls down into India. A little bit crept across the Himalayas in terms of very basic papermaking through the Tibetans and the various peoples like Gurkhas and people in Bhutan who were doing it. But each stage, it was very slow for the technology to move forward, as you can see by all those dates. So those are, that was from Dard Hunter's book on papermaking of the 1930s. That was what were thought to be the dates of the first occurrence of production in those places, as best the records were then. I'm not sure really that there's a great deal of change in those dates. I think they're still, they're fairly well documented once you get into the Arab world and into Europe.
When did we start using paper in this country? Importing it?
Well, I don't know actually, but I would think about 12 or 1300. It used to be the case that for anything important you were required to use parchment, and there was a huge industry going with parchment, because parchment is a secondary material as well, secondary to producing food, so what you do with these skins and stuff, and very labour intensive to make a sheet of parchment. And then the whole business of scribes was very labour intensive, this, that and the other. When printing started in Gutenberg, 1490 something? Yes? Yes. You all should know. Then that meant you could do a lot more printing, and wasn't enough parchment to go around. There was a bugger to print on, well, bugger to write on for that matter. So demand grew for something cheaper and more readily available. And although paper was being used then for a certain amount for writing on and for wrapping and that sort of thing, it really got a big impetus for this demand for printing paper. And the nature of printing was such that we wanted standard rectangular sheets that always did the same thing. So increasingly, paper became a competitive material. But certain things were still required until very recently. Acts of Parliament, the original Act of Parliament in the House of Lords Library, had to be printed on vellum, and I'm not sure when that stopped. Anybody know? But assuming it has stopped.
When did it stop?
Yeah, very recent, I think.
Yes, I mean there are late 19th century prints.
Oh, much more recent than that. I think it would be 1970s, 1980s, something like that. But parchment, is several times more expensive than even the most expensive handmade paper, so it was an economic thing, really. So I wouldn't think there was much paper imported into England until the printing technology demanded it. And there were closed shops, the scribes, didn't want this nasty stuff coming in, and the vellum makers